Hello everybody. For this video, I would like to discuss a very fascinating mental health disorder known as dissociative identity disorder and previously termed as multiple personality disorder, which many might be more familiar with. This disorder is very fascinating because the individual experiencing it will literally have different identities roll through them and shift in and out of these identities or personalities. And this disorder stems from that term dissociation. With the dissociation, there's this sort of unreality that comes out of them, this depersonalization, and the sense that they're watching themselves. So, while the body of the individual is there, what happens is that this consciousness, or consciousness in plural terms, starts separating from one another, and it can just range. So what happens is that with these separate consciousness that starts developing out of that individual's psychological state of being, they are constantly becoming that observer, and the other identities that are withstanding this individual become outsiders to the one that's taking over at that moment, or the one that presents itself in that situation. And I'll go into reasons and situations that may trigger it in just a little bit. Another thing is that it has a couple symptoms. For example, I have read a couple of literary books, which interestingly enough have been written by, one of them is called Switching Time by Dr. Richard Baer, and this is from the psychologist's viewpoint of treating somebody with this disorder who had 17 different personalities. And another book is called The Flock, and it's written actually by somebody who had this disorder. So from what I have understood from that, the simplest term that they put it into is that they lose time. So what happens to them is that all of a sudden there's this time that is uncalled for. There's this chunk of their day that they cannot recall because that dissociation occurred and that other personality that they have created or manifested took over during that time. So they have a sense that they suddenly lost their memory because of the fact that their identity changed during that. And sometimes the depersonalization isn't so heavy. So sometimes the main identity of the individual can see and know that an identity took over, and the other identity knows that it took over in the role. So it all kind of is dependent on the severity of the case. It can range from a person blacking out and then all of a sudden wake up and not knowing what happened, but people, for example, people that they encountered will tell them exactly how their encounter went over and how they interacted with them, what that person did, what they said, what they didn't say. And therefore that'll be their only basis of evidence of what happened during that time, which can be very daunting, and I can imagine it can be very scary for the individual because all of a sudden they lost control of their time, they lost control of a chunk of their day, and they have to hear from other people what they were doing. So I can imagine that that's very daunting. And there are some circumstances that I have read where the person starts feeling that depersonalization take over, and they feel a little bit more outside of themselves. Like there's a very big similarity to an out-of-body experience that they have, and they just know, communicating in their head, that the other personality is going to take over and fill in their shoes, and they kind of just observe it. So I thought that was very fascinating that it does range in severity, and there are a couple different explanations. But before I go into that, I would like to say that in order for somebody to range in this disorder, for example, I'm pretty sure you're also familiar with split personality, but in that sense, it will be two personalities. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily a DSM-5 classified term anymore because it has constantly evolved. For example, multiple personality disorder has evolved into dissociative identity disorder. So I'm not sure how seriously or how weighed upon that specific disorder is now, but I do know that dissociative identity disorder, in order for an individual to be diagnosed and classified under that, there need to be two or more personality or identities that control the person's behavior. And interestingly enough, on top of the fact that this individual is changing identities and changing personalities, hold on really quickly. I would like to address that sound is my cat yowling and meowing like crazy. I just want to advise you that that's what's going on, and I like to keep my videos as authentic as possible. So, side note. When somebody has these different personalities and these different identities that they shift in and out of, it is very fascinating because on top of all, their brain chemistry changes. And with all of that, they actually have their own voice. They have their own mannerisms. And it's just so fascinating because of the fact that there have been cases even where a personality will speak a completely different language. And even to the extent where, if, for example, their handedness changes. So if the main dominant individual is right-handed, a personality may be left-handed, and that person has no experience in that. So that's what's so fascinating about this disorder. It'll cause the other alters, so to speak, to have these skills and these personality traits that the others do not. Their mannerisms will be completely different, and on top of all, the memories, there will be selective memories that are very different to each individual and unique to each individual personality. And I'll go into explanations as to why too. And while this disorder typically isn't dangerous, there have been instances where they can be very extreme personalities. So for example, there will be good and bad personalities. There will be some that are more dangerous than others, some that all of a sudden act on all the impulses, and then some that'll be very rational, and some that'll just be wanting to be different people, you know? So it can range, and it can be in such severe cases where one can be animalistic and primal and act on impulses and not behave in that acceptable range of human behavior. So that's when it can get very, it can just be a little bit more of what you portray in movies, for example. And there are several explanations to that, and I would like to dive into all different explanations and be able to link them to those different characteristics that fall within the mannerisms and personality traits. So, they show that distinctive brain and body states are associated with different personalities. Again, when I go back to that, the fact that their brain chemistry changes, they say that has a lot to do with what triggers the personality, but at the same time, a lot of other explanations counteract that argument by saying that it's actually the depersonalization that changes the brain chemistry. And under a brain scan, the brain waves and activity do change very, very rapidly with a person who is dissociating at that moment. The explanations for that is that the biggest one is that they presume, and it typically is the case once it's uncovered in therapy, that it has a lot to do with repressed memories, thoughts, or feelings. So if an individual has severe enough experiences in their life that they need to repress and basically erase from their memory, it can actually grow into this disorder because of the fact that they have repressed that so much. All of a sudden, they can create a personality that helps them deal with that traumatic event. So it's very, very, very fascinating. Like, I cannot begin to stress that. And the reason why is that disorder may even develop at the onset of the traumatic event. In most cases in these books, for example, the individual experiencing it did have, and I'm sorry if this triggers it in anybody, I'm sorry if these terms do trigger anything, but they do have a history where it's a little bit more on the side of child molestation, or there was a very severe thing that violated their trust and betrayed them as a child, and therefore it has sometimes even manifested and developed at such an early stage as that. And because of how traumatic that event was, they over the years have repressed that memory and it's not in there anymore. But at the moment, in order to deal with such a tough and awful experience that they went through, they dissociated away from their bodies. They got out of their bodies, so to speak, and they had a braver individual fill in their shoes and take that place to be able to withstand that experience. So in some case studies that I have read, it's because that person experienced, for example, that child molestation experience that they had in their life, and they could not face that because that's a very awful thing for anyone to experience, let alone a child. So therefore, they got out of their bodies to be able to survive that, and therefore, like, that brave individual that they have manifested or created in their heads took over for them. And it'll maybe appear right away. Maybe they'll start dissociating after that very rapidly since they're at an early stage. Or it may even stay like that for a long time. And then when they're an adult, they will start dissociating. And that's when those multiple personalities start splurging out. Because that multiple personality is holding all of those repressed memories. And maybe that person starts developing it. And therefore, when they develop it, sometimes it can even happen when somebody has to recall those repressed memories. And all of a sudden they develop a personality that can deal with that can face that head on because it's such a heavy thing to have experienced. So the prime purpose that coincides with that repressed memory explanation is because they want to protect the person from that overwhelming situation or emotion. And it typically does get triggered by very stressful, heavy events. For example, even the individual, if they have experienced a very, very hard loss in their life, whether it be a person or a situation or just a whole spectrum of a period of their life, if they couldn't deal with that personality that they create in their psychological state will take over for them and will step up to the plate to face the challenge, so to speak. And with all of that, people also see it as post-traumatic. I mean, it stems from that traumatic event, so therefore it can be a way to deal with that post-traumatic stress. And in psychoanalysis, which is typically a term coined and a little bit more linked to the psychologist Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst perspective, it is seen as a defense mechanism. So defense mechanisms kind of have that umbrella term where it has to do with projection, repression, suppression, regression, etc. So it can be seen as a defense mechanism. These identities take over as a defense mechanism when someone needs to regress to an earlier stage in their life. So for example, this individual who has experienced that traumatic event I mentioned earlier, one of their personalities, even though they're an adult, a personality that they could possibly develop is that strong personality that faced that tough situation for them, that took over for them. And they also very oftentimes carry on another personality that's them as a child. So that personality can even range in age. So they will be, for example, a 34-year-old adult female, and they can switch in and out and alter into the sudden superhero, for example, that they turned into when they needed to deal with that very tough occurrence. And also they will switch into the 7-year-old child they were when they experienced that traumatic event. Maybe the name may change though, but they will develop different parts of themselves and different roles that they had to show up for to deal with that event and the aftermath after that. So that's why it can also be seen as post-traumatic. It can be seen as a post-traumatic occurrence and reaction. It can be seen as a defense mechanism. And another explanation is maybe not in such a severe case where it's linked to a memory at an early stage in their life, but if someone is going through a very tough circumstance, like for example in the book The Flock, the woman developed it while she was going through a divorce, and that was a huge life-altering thing that was going on, right? So then she started developing all these different personalities and these different facets about her that started coming out, but like in extreme ways, if that makes sense. And it was a way of her being able to deal with her anxiety. And that kind of also links with the defense mechanism explanation. So she needed to deal with her anxiety, and she had these different little personality traits that would manifest from that, and that she would switch in and out of depending on whatever it was that she did. And to put it in other terms too, it can be a little bit of the implicit things that we bottle up in us. So it's very possible that the person experiencing it may not necessarily have it linked to childhood or anything, but even if it is linked to a lot of traumatic experiences they've experienced in their life, a lot of the personalities can be who they are in present time and the different facets in them, like the impulses that they don't act upon, will all of a sudden manifest through an identity. Their interest, for example, even if they're interested in a movie character or a certain music group or something, one of their personalities can very much so be based upon that musician or that actor or that character. All of a sudden, one of their personalities will embody that because of the fact that that's already in their psychological state, that's in their subconscious. Those things are in their value system. Those things are there somewhere in their subconscious, and their brain kind of just picks out what things they will veer towards, and what impulses they'll act towards, and what character they'll act towards, and they'll take on all the different little mannerisms and all the different little things. So that's when it also, to make full circle, they will have good and bad. So the person who experienced that traumatic event or is going through that severe stress or severe life-altering thing that their current self cannot face. So those identities in them and those personalities in them will take over. The good one will be probably like the diplomatic one, the one who is very strong and stern and fearless to face that situation up to the plate. And then the bad one will be all those impulses that have caused it in them, all that repressed anger, all that frustration, all of a sudden will be manifested in that bad personality. And it'll cause this person to be a little bit more impulsive, aggressive. That certain personality will show as that. And for example, like I'm sure if you've clicked this video, you have for sure seen the movie Split or heard of it, when he was able to change into like the Beast, for example. There have been instances in case studies that show that a person who dissociates can also become another living thing. It doesn't always necessarily have to be limited to being human. They can even turn into an animal. In their head, they'll be that like primitive animal. And that can also be a little bit more of a spectrum of also maybe a bad personality if it's in the form of aggression, and it can hurt other individuals that cross their paths. And there are ways of treating it though. While it's very fascinating, I can imagine how frustrating it is for the individual experiencing it, and the fact that the people around them aren't going to know who they're dealing with at that moment, or what situations are going to spring up that person to switch in and out of that altar. But the treatment is, interestingly enough, the goal of the treatment is to integrate all the personalities to oneself. So to be able to communicate with them and communicate in and out of the different personalities, keep journals and keep certain treatment options for each person, because even each individual and personality can manifest their own problems, their own issues, and their own impulses. So when the psychologist or psychiatrist is treating the individual with this disorder, they're going to be needing to treat each personality, so to speak, because each personality has their own weight, they have their own demons, they have their own experiences, memories, and personalities and mannerisms to them. So they need to treat each individual, communicate them all together, and the ultimate goal is to be able to slowly make those personalities just mesh into the one self, and mesh as just characteristics more so than characters of the person. Another thing will be psychotherapy in the form of psychoanalysis if the person needs to reassess and readdress things in their past, and they need to reassess memories. A couple of different techniques also in order to reach that ultimate goal of integrating the personalities into one would also be hypnosis, because sometimes it may be tough for any of the personalities to be able to dig deep into those experiences that cause them to need to protect themselves by dissociating, inventing these personalities within them to be able to handle stressful situations or that traumatic experience they went through. So sometimes hypnosis can be able to pull the source out of it all and pull the reasoning out of all of them. And just talk therapy. Again, the person treating the individual with this disorder needs to be able to talk to each and every one of the personalities, including the main person that goes to seek the help, and be able to kind of communicate all of them together. If they already don't have that ability to, be able to observe one another in action, it's important for this kind of like group meeting, so to speak, for the individual experiencing this disorder and for the body experiencing the disorder, to just be able to have like a conference meeting over time to be able to agree to become one and just merge into one and see each personality that's split up as just facets of that one personality. So this disorder is so fascinating for me to talk about, and I'm very passionate about it, and I have yet to learn a lot. This isn't all the information that there is out there. There's so much more to learn and so much more to uncover, but here is just my 2 cents of what I do know about it, and I hope that this has proved to be very informative for you. And if you are experiencing it yourself, I mean, that is very fascinating. I hope you so much good luck on this journey and being able to unveil all the things that have led you up to this point. But I enjoyed talking about this disorder, and I hope you all enjoyed yourselves as well. Thank you so much for supporting, and have a good mental health day.